So good evening to everyone and welcome to our shir. It's nice to have you here. So we're gonna start off by muting everyone and we're gonna thank our sponsors. So today's shiur is sponsored by Dr. Andrea Stern and Isaac Singer. It is in honor of their grandson Matan Singer's 4th birthday. So happy birthday, Matan. And mazel tov to the grandparents. And we should only celebrate wonderful things for many years with gesund, with good health. Okay, so thank you so much appreciated. So we have to learn a little bit about Pesach. We have to get into the Pesach spirit. And it's an uplifting holiday, a lot of positive things to talk about when it comes to Pesach. So we'll keep it halachic tonight. Some halachic issues, some of them practical, some of them perhaps interesting. And next week, we officially designated our Thursday night shiur as the Shabbos Hagadol Drosha, or the Drasha of Shabbat Hagadol, same thing. And we're going to talk a little bit more of what we should be thinking as we are going to experience Pesach, right? Good Jews allow things to occur in their head. And sometimes we have that responsibility of trying to meditate and think, what exactly is this day about, right? What are we trying to achieve? So that's what we're going to be addressing Be'ezrat Hashem next week. This week, it's halachic. Okay, we've been doing Pesach for many years already, thank God. So it's hard to find a new, unless you want a new chumrah, but my feeling is that you'll manage without that. But we'll do a little bit of a review of some issues. What I would like to start off with is with a section we'll call Mishe'elot Shenishalu. One of the texts that I enjoy going through, halachic text, is the work of Rav Gedalia Felder Zatzal, Yisodei Yeshurun. We've all heard of Rav Gedalia, the great Rav Gedalia Felder, and he writes beautifully. And in many of his halachic discussions, he has a section that's designated for She'elot Shenishalu, questions that were asked. So we're going to start off tonight with two questions that were asked. And we're going to try to provide an answer. The first one is short. The second one is a bit longer. And then we'll cover some other issues. Mishe'elot shenishalu. So question number one. Last week, we had a discussion that addresses the uniqueness of this year. The fact that you have an Erev Pesach on Shabbat changes things. And as a result, there are, due to the fact that, for example, you can't have the fast day of the firstborn on Shabbat. You can't burn the chametz on Shabbat. You can't search for chametz Friday night with a candle. So therefore, we've talked a little bit about the adjustments. One of the things we mentioned is the fact that we have a little bit of a challenge on Shabbat morning regarding the meal, because we can't eat matzah on Erev Pesach. To eat bread, that would be fine, but number one, you have to be sure to finish it 2 hours before midday, which this year works at around 11:18. But the problem is to have bread, actual bread, on the table in the house when your house is Pesach. It's challenging. It's doable, right? Good suggestions were presented. So I mentioned the option of Ramosha Feinstein, that what you do is you use egg matzah. And in our house, if I'm not wrong, we're going to be using egg matzah. The benefit of egg matzah is that although we have a tradition of not eating it at a time that we don't eat chametz, in other words, we're going to finish eating the actual egg matzah by 11:18 a.m., however, we don't have to concern ourselves about chametz because egg matzah is really kosher for Pesach. Yes, there's an Ashkenazi tradition that it is avoided, but it's a tradition. it doesn't affect the status of your food. You don't have to worry about the crumbs. You can have it on the table. If the children want to continue eating it a little bit afterwards, it's no big deal until midday. It's something we're far more lenient with. So that's what we're going to do. Some people, I'm sure, are going to figure out a way of eating bread. You're more than welcome. Others are going to rely on Ramosha and eat the egg matzah. And I mentioned that we have to be sure to finish it by 11:18. Now, the question that was asked, so here we go. Question number one. The COR put out a wonderful booklet with a lot of nice information and pictures and stories. A very nice booklet the COR put out. There's some in the shul. Perhaps for those who don't have access to it, we could work out a system of getting it to them. In the COR booklet, they too spelled out the unique guidelines for Erev Pesach this year. And they mentioned that the proper practice should be that you complete your whole meal by that cutoff time. In other words, when I presented the information, I said, finish eating bread or egg matzah by a specific time, 11:18. They stated that you should actually finish the whole meal by that cutoff time. So the question I was asked is, number one, where did they come up with that? Number two, do I have to worry about it? So to answer your question, we have to analyze a section in Shulchan Aruch that talks about brachot. And it tells us the following. In general, if a person eats some fish, they'll make a shahakol, right? If they eat some tomatoes, they'll make a borei pri adama. But if you're eating it as part of a meal, and the norm is to eat it together with bread, it becomes secondary to the bread. And this is a halacha we're familiar with, that your bracha on the bread, the motzi, covers all that which is part of your meal. So we do not make a bracha on the fish, and you don't make a bracha on the cholent. It is all included in your motzi. This is what the halacha tells us. Now, in Talmudic times, it appears that they had a practice which was known as siluk hapat. In other words, there was a practice that they would just take away all the bread from the table, and you no longer have access to bread as you are eating. And the Talmud notes that at that point, since you no longer have bread, if new food items are brought, they do require a bracha. Okay, so in Talmudic times, you're sitting there at a meal, and they remove the bread, siluk hapat, they remove it. And then they go ahead and place on the tables some roasted carrots. Those roasted carrots are not covered by the bread. You would have to make a borei pri ha'adama. That's what we are told. As a result, now this explains why the COR booklet makes that recommendation, that perhaps they believe that it's proper to be machmir, that since you in essence have a siluk hapat, in other words, come 11:18 and you're no longer going to eat bread and you're no longer going to eat egg matzah, it is as if the bread is removed from the table, and perhaps it is actually physically removed from the table. So therefore, your food items afterwards, there's a questionable status. Do you make a bracha now suddenly on your potatoes or not? So to avoid it, they recommended finish the meal prior to that specific time. Okay? Question number two is, do I have to worry about it? So I'll tell you, if you're not machmir, you don't have to worry about it. I don't plan to worry about it, because the commentators note that in Talmudic times, the removal was not just of the bread, but it was a removal of the whole table. In other words, that people would actually have small tables in front of them. And then at some point in the meal, when they would finish, they would remove the table. And then they would come with some hors d'oeuvres, perhaps. Those hors d'oeuvres, since there's no table in front of you and no bread in front of you, they are not part of the meal. And even though you are before Birkat HaMazon, you would require a bracha on whatever hors d'oeuvres they offer. However, nowadays, we don't have a siluk of shulchan. We don't remove tables. And therefore, nowadays, your meal is covered even by the bread that you are no longer going to be eating after 11:18. Okay, so this is just a question that was asked. Halachically, we stick to what we taught in the past. And hopefully that clarifies why there are differences. There's nothing wrong with some people taking a different school. Judaism has always had that, and we're always comfortable with traditional and different approaches. Now, question number two. I have a good friend down in Memphis, Tennessee, Rafi, and at times he'll contact me with a halachic question, and it's always an opportunity, to reconnect and perhaps to research a few interesting areas of halacha. And Rafi asked me a very basic question, which took me on a very interesting journey. His father makes different foods, and it seems like sauerkraut is one of his specialties that he makes for Pesach. Okay? Now, his father actually also makes moonshine, but that's a different discussion. So the question he asked was, it appears that your sauerkraut needs caraway seeds. What I remember caraway seeds is that the old timers would ask for rye in bakeries, and they had some caraway seeds on top. That's what I remember. And the younger people would say, I would like a rye, but please, no caraway seeds. That's what I remember regarding caraway seeds. So the question was, so here we go. What's the status of caraway seeds for Pesach? Are they or are they not kitniot? Okay, valid question. So I first, not just old timers. Okay. So the question was caraway. So before I had an opportunity to review and look it up, I did a fast search with the OU, and I'll share with you my personal journey, and that's what we're going to be discussing for the next few minutes. My caraway seed journey. Now, kitniot, for some, it is a way of connecting to their past. It's the minhag. It's what I've seen in the past. I feel a connection, even though it's hard to explain it, but I feel a connection to the past. For the others I've interacted with over the years, it is something that is very agitating and disturbing. Like, it's enough, Why did this come into play? And there's a different school that takes an approach that they are uncomfortable with the practice. And they were all good Jews, by the way, because for any approach I mention here, I could find in a halachic authority that takes a similar approach. There are those that over the years try to add more to the kitniot list. There are those that try to limit the expansion. I love sharing the story how Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and this is in the 18th century, lands up in Mannheim before Pesach, and he finds out that the local rabbi is going to declare that potatoes are kitniot. The local balabatim are very unhappy, and they were happy to hear that they have an honorable guest in town, the great Rabbi Yaakov Emden. They turn to Rabbi Yaakov Emden and they share with him the story that the rabbi is coming up with a new chumrah to prohibit potatoes. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden made his way to the rabbi, argued with him, and forced him not to accept and declare such a stringency. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden took great pride in the fact that it was due to my involvement I was able to save people's Yom Tov. So this is old news, kitniot, different attitudes. For me personally, it's always fascinating. It's fascinating because you learn about communities, you learn about attitudes. We've talked over the years about Rav Kook's, desire to give an hashgacha to a sesame oil in Yafo in 1909. And how the old timers in Yerushalayim were very upset that he was giving a hashgacha to something that traditionally they thought is avoided. So these conversations, these debates, these halachic discussions are ones that I simply love. Sometimes I'm fascinated by the fact how European rabbis were perhaps not familiar with all foods. In other words, if you would turn to rabbis of the 18th century and would point to a Mishnah where it talks about shumshumin, and you ask them, what are shumshumin? And they would tell you it's poppy seeds. Now, we all know that shumshumin are sesame seeds. Why did the rabbis of the 18th century not know? Because there were no sesames in the marketplace in Vilna or in Varsha, so they simply didn't know. Later on, when Jews arrived in the land of Israel, and the Arabs pointed to sesame and they said the zum zum, so then they made the connection and they realized that that's what the Mishnah refers to. It is always fascinating, Kitniot. I'm a deep believer that we should stick to our minhagim, not to add, not to detract. In other words, stick to what we have been doing in the past. In the past, peanut oil was available, which I've discussed in the past, the fact why peanut oil is 100% fine for two reasons. Peanuts and oil, meaning peanuts are really not kitniot, Ramosha Feinstein says. An oil production that's dry is really not an issue, and therefore, that is something that should be okay. Unfortunately, it's not seen in the marketplace. Kitniot are always fascinating. So this year's journey, this year's addition to the research is going to be regarding the caraway seed. How relevant this is, I don't know. So here we go. The discussion will start with sharing the following screen with you. Okay? I hope you see here, I hope you see on the screen this is from the OU website. The OU website tells us what was that? Oh, no. The OU website, that was a link, by the way. Okay, the OU website tells us the following are considered kitniot. Caraway. So you see here, according to the OU, according to the website, caraway are kitniot. And then the website continues, the following are not considered kitniot. I'm just mentioning one from a long list for a specific reason, but may require special checking, and that is cumin. I've become a fan of cumin over the years. So here we have it, caraway and cumin. Why am I focusing specifically on these two? After I mentioned to my friend Rafi that according to the OU, caraway is a problem and is kitniot, I decided to do a little bit more research. And my research took me to a Taz. What do I mean taking me to a Taz? There was a great rabbi who lives in the Ukraine, Rab David Halevi Siegel, who lives into the second half of the 17th century. His work, the Turei Zahav, is a go-to text in the study of halacha in all sections of Shulchan Aruch. And the Taz shares with us the following. So we're going to go through the Hebrew. And he tells us the following. You should know there is a Mishnah, and the Mishnah talks about something called katzach. It's in a Mishnah. And he tells us that this katzach refers to kimmel. And as you all know, and again, even the non-old timers know, that caraway is called kimmel. You want to rye with kimmel. So he tells us that ketzach shekorin kimmel. What's the status for Pesach? So here, this is the area of Shulchan Aruch where kitniot are addressed, where the poskim want to clarify what is yes considered kitniot, what is not. So when it comes to kimmel, he shares with us a tradition. Shamati, I've heard, mechalkin, that they say it depends, because as we'll see soon, there are two types of kimmel. One is called oto shekorin krom kimmel. One is called krom kimmel. Krom kimmel, says Rabbi David Halevi, mevi'in oto mebedinot acherot. It is imported. It is imported into northern Eastern Europe from other areas, and therefore asur bepesach. The tradition is not to use krom kimmel on Pesach, because their garinin, it appears that their seeds are similar to grain, to dagan. Aval, continues the Taz, oto hanikra feld kimmel, that which is called feld kimmel, mutar bepesach, he gives a green light for feld kimmel. Why? She'en surato kedagan, it doesn't look like grain. So after I read the Taz, I decide, you know what? I'm going to try to understand what he means that there are two types of kimmel. What are these different kimmels? So you go to Google Translate, and let's start with Caraway. I type in Caraway, and Caraway is translated into German as Feldkümmel. So I said to myself, that's quite clear that Feldkümmel, where the Taz tells us that is mutar bepesach, is actually referring to caraway. Now, the cumin in German is actually called Kreuzkümmel, like cross kümmel. So it appears that perhaps, and here it's not as clear. Here it's translated as Kreuzkümmel, where the Taz on the other hand calls it Krummkümmel. It is bent, it's a bit Krummkümmel. So perhaps, and this was something that I thought of, perhaps when the Taz tells us that there are two types of kimmel, one of them refers to caraway, which is 100% fine, and the one that the Taz views as problematic perhaps is cumin, because cumin is the imported one. That's what I thought. Now, what bothered me with this is the fact that a chef I'm not, right? My palate is not perhaps the greatest, but what I could tell you is I know the difference between the taste of caraway and cumin, and there's no relationship in their taste. So it bothered me a little bit, and therefore there's a lack of clarity in understanding the statement of the Turei Zahav of Rab David Alevi Siegel, because to claim that there are two types of kimmel, and one of them is cumin, and one is caraway, I wasn't confident due to the fact that their taste is so different. Now, based on my reading of the Taz, what I do have on the surface is a heter, or basically a clear statement that indicates that caraway is not kitniot. So I had a little bit of difficulty with the psak of the OU. Now, before you get concerned about the cumin, in other words, perhaps some of you have some cumin that you purchase kosher Pesach. And by the way, if it's in its seed form, we'll see soon. There's no real question. But when it's pulverized, when it's ground, it obviously needs hashgacha. Just for the record, a great posek, Rav Yaakov Reisher, who wrote a few decades after the Taz, writes, "Ein lahachmir." In other words, don't be machmir with either. What I have here is the following up until this point. If my assessment of the Taz is correct, caraway should be fine. No one was machmir with caraway seeds, and therefore I wasn't sure why on earth the OU wrote that. So I contacted, past Friday, I contacted the OU, I contacted Rav Schechter, I contacted a few people asking them, why on earth does the OU prohibit caraway? You remember, I didn't make this up. It's on the top of the list. Caraway is considered kitniot. Now, so I decided to continue with my research a little bit due to the fact that I had this difficulty. Maybe I simply don't know the Taz. Maybe it's talking about different types of caraways, because my belief that one is cumin and one is kimmel didn't make sense. So there's a book in Germany. There's a German scholar. He's considered the biggest expert on the history and the culture of spices. And his name is Hans-Georg Kuster. I hope I pronounced his name right, okay? And he wrote a book called Kleine Kulturgeschichte der Geusers. You'll forgive me. Now, basically, a brief cultural history of spices. Kleine, brief. Kultur, culture. Der Geusers, of spices. Okay? This is Hans-Georg Kuster's book. I don't have access to it. And even if I would have access to it, it wouldn't help me, because the few words in Yiddish are not going to get me through a textbook in German. But what I did decide to do at some point this weekend, I don't remember if it was before or after Shabbos, was to try to perhaps contact Professor Dr. Hans-Georg Kuster and ask him my question. Is it really possible that people considered cumin and caraway to be somehow related, because the Taz, if my reading is correct, is telling us that they are. So within 12 hours after emailing him, I get a response from Professor Hans-Jörg. A nice email. He was very, very kind, if you think about it, to respond to some random fellow worrying about the laws of Kitnios. And he tells us that you should know that there are two Apaeician spicy species with similar fruit. One of them is the cumin, Groß Kümmel, and the other one is Caraway, which is Feldkümmel. The professor continues and says, in spite of having, right, a nomadical similar fruit, the taste of both is very different, that I know. And then he says the following: when it comes to Roman cuisine, Near East, cumin was taken, whereas caraway was chosen in the areas north of the Alps, like England and Germany. And then he points out that even though they are different in taste, the same recipes were taken south and north of the Alps, which resulted in different tastes of southern and northern dishes. And he writes, the professor says, this is concluded from archaeological evidence, okay? And then he tells us it was necessary to import the spicy species to northern areas, which for me, it tells me two things from what Professor Kuster shared with us. Number one, the Taz, without a doubt, was talking about two types of kimmel, and he mentions one is imported. Remember, the Taz tells us straight out that there is a kimmel which mevi'in oto medinot acherot asur bepesach. The Taz was of the opinion that the cumin should not be used on Pesach. It is similar to grape. But the Taz was also of the opinion, and there is no question in my mind, that the Feldkümmel is caraway, mutar bepesach. There is no one that says that caraway is kitniot. Okay? So my question on the OU was basically, why did they give a heter to cumin? I'm not going to fight a heter. I'm not going to fight a heter. Remember, I have other authorities like the Chog Yaakov who give a green light. So we're okay with the cumin, especially kitnios are minhagim, and the minig is, if the OU gives ashgacha, the minig is fine. But my concern is more, why was the OU machmir with the caraway if there's a reading in the Taz that's otherwise? So I corresponded with a rabbi, a very pleasant, a good, great scholar who's in charge of the Pesach productions of the OU, Rabbi Gerstern. He was very, very helpful. We went back and forth over email. Eventually, I gave him a call. And what he basically said is, listen, Rabbi Belsky Zatzal was a big Talmid Chacham and a big posek for the OU many, many years ago, stated that it is impossible for us to know exactly what the Taz is talking about. So therefore, the Taz cannot be a reference. And he says that it relates to minhag, and he believes that the minhag was to avoid caraway. So I argued with him. I said, but right now I'm providing for you a clear reading, right? I have a German scholar. What else can you ask for? And he said, it's in the system already. And like, you know, he chuckled a little bit. It's in the system. It's very hard to change things here. And that was the end of this very interesting discussion that I had with him. Bottom line is, first of all, ishkayach to Hans-Jörg Kuster. I give him a grace ishkayach. And bottom line is that I was able to inform my friend Rafi that guess what? You have a stamp of approval for your caraway. Okay. And, you know, other ashgachas also gave a green light, but that's it's just an interesting piece of information that gave me this little bit of a journey. And that concludes the section of Mishe'elot Shenishalu. These are the questions that we were asked, and that is the bottom line regarding these issues. Now, once we are, okay, from David and Wolf, so if we buy a new bottle of caraway seeds, can we use them? caraway seeds that are not ground, if they are whole and you look at them, you check and they look clean, it's 100% fine for Pesach. It's not kitnios, it's not processed. Enjoy your caraway seeds. I don't know what you use it for, but you could enjoy your caraway seeds. They are not kitniot. We're going to follow the Taz, we're going to follow the Chok Yaakov, and that's the end of that brief discussion. Okay, grab likes. So here we go. Now, in the past, we've had a whole discussion about fenugreek, all kind of interesting discussions that relate to kitnios. But let's do something a little bit halachic. When it comes, a few basic halachas that I would like to review because I think there's a benefit there. On the eve of the 13th of Nisan, Thursday night, we're going to check this year our home, Bdikas Chometz. Now, Bdikas Chometz in an era when we clean our houses for weeks leading to it has changed. And in many cases, it's more of a review. In other words, you want to go through area by area and ask yourself, is this area going to be used during Pesach? Okay. Was it cleaned? Was it checked? You review areas. And areas you look at and you know that this is an area that you are planning to sell, that you authorize the rabbi to sell. Well, it's a good time to tape it up and no longer use it. Obviously, you could continue using it until Shabbat because the time of the transaction, although the actual sale is going to take place Friday morning, the time on the document will be late in the afternoon, but the goal would be to finalize. Now, if you do have chametz, the Rambam tells us that if you do have chametz, that you plan to eat on Friday, that you plan to eat on Shabbat until the time when you are no longer allowed to, the Rambam tells us they need to be kept in one place. So you can't have a few areas designated for actual chametz that you plan to eat. Chametz you plan to eat must be in one place. It's very logical. You did already a bdika, you checked your house, have it in one location. The 10 pieces of bread that we put out is a minhag. It's a minhag. And the minhag shouldn't take over the more important responsibility that we have on that evening, to review everything throughout the house, to be sure that we check drawers, to be sure that areas that are sold are designated. So the 10 pieces of bread are a minhag. You know, I shared in the past the story that there was a great rabbi in the beginning of the 15th century, one of the great German authorities, Reb Zalman Runkel. Reb Zalman Runkel. So Reb Zalman Runkel was of the opinion that there is no such thing as putting out the 10 pieces. He believed that it's a distraction. He believed that it could create a halachic issue because if you put it in an area you checked already, so it nullifies your checking. So Reb Zalman was against it. But nevertheless, it was done in Reb Zalman's house, we are told, because his wife believed that you should do it. And we are told that it became the annual minhag that the wife would put out the 10 pieces. He was not happy. And afterwards, he would recheck every area that there was chametz, even if they found it. And even if they had the count of 10, Reb Zalman Runkel was simply so much against the minhag. He had no choice at home because, you know, his wife made the decision. But nevertheless, it just indicates this is not the goal of the night. So it is sometimes fun that you put out the pieces and it becomes a little bit of a searching. And boy, do you want to be sure you find all 10. There was a rabbi of a posek in Chicago that always notes that if you use 10 pieces, be sure that they are small pieces. Be sure that every one on its own is less than the volume of an olive. Because if it is less than an olive, if for whatever reason you can't find number 10, you don't have to check your whole house because it's nullified. If it would be a larger piece, you have an issue, right? And our friend in Memphis mentioned the story that one year they put out 10 pieces and they had that ceremony that every single time that they would find the piece, the father would pick it up and go, da-da, with great enthusiasm. And they were able to do it 24 hours before the Seder, but they only found 9 out of the 10. Ta-da! and they spent the next couple hours looking for it until they gave up. 24 hours later, during the Seder, the 3-year-old boy runs down the stairs with great enthusiasm. Ta-da! He found piece number 10. Okay, so this is not exactly a fun experience. Just remember, I personally at home try to keep them in a simple location. There is no need to have someone else put out the 10 pieces. Okay, I myself put out the 10 pieces. Some, Avigail would want to be the one putting out and make a game, but I'm sorry, I want to just do the minhag and move on. I put out the 10 pieces. I usually put 2 together, so I only have to remember 5 locations and not 10. And perhaps as I get older, I'll put 4 together that I only have to remember 3 locations. But after I put them in the bag and have them in the designated area, I walk around with my flashlight. It's another liberal tradition I have. I don't use the candle. I like the flashlight more. I think it's more conducive for actual searching. And therefore, I focus on what the night is about. So that's this piece of information, number 1, that I think has some importance and significance. Piece of information number 2 is my annual defense of my practice of matzah, of our practice at home of matzah on the Seder night. Because every single year, I feel I have to defend my practice. So this year I'm gonna defend it I'm referring to the fact that on our Seder table we have matzah shmura that is actually machine matzah shmura. So while I would guess almost all of you use hand shmura, there is a minority out there that uses machine shmura. And the reason I have to defend it is for the following. We talked in the past in great depth and in detail about the history of the machine matzah. And yes, in the early days, the matzah production made by machines in the 1850s and the 1860s did not have the standards that we have today. In other words, I remember once reading a responsa of Rabbi Shvadron, who was the big Pesach in Galicia. And he wrote a letter in 1895 that addressed the matzah production in St. Louis of 1895. And after you read that tshuva, I guarantee that if someone would hand you those matzahs from 126 years ago, you would consider them chametz. Anyone. Because it talks about the 30-minute process of production of the machine matzah. So the production in the past of machine, a century ago, were problematic. Once they've been upgraded drastically over the past century, the standard of your machine matzah is very, very high. And I personally argue even better than hand, because you're not relying on a person. It's a process, it's clean, it's smooth, they clean it out well. Your matzos are 100% kosher lePesach. Now, the concern that some people have is the following. We are told that our matzah for the Seder night had to be baked and processed lishma. Lishma. What does lishma mean? It means that someone was watching, that it was done appropriately, done halachically, and that person, the Jew watching, had in mind that as this food product is coming into existence, the final product will be used for a mitzvah. In other words, to have intention that that which is being baked, that which is being kneaded, that which is being milled, and that which is being harvested be done for the sake of a product that will be used for a mitzvah. Okay, lishma. And therefore, for example, your matzah shmura for the Seder night should be shmura from the time of harvesting. So in Arizona, at some point a few months ago, there was a mashgiach watching as the tractor harvested the grain to be sure that it wasn't raining, to be sure that the workers weren't drinking from their water bottles as they were processing it. And the mashgiach standing there was thinking the final product of this wheat will be used for a mitzvah. That's lishma.
So to when it was milled, there was a mashgiach standing there. And clearly during the process of kneading, so if it's done by hand, we have no question. The person kneading it by hand has intention. The question is, how can you have a lishma if the kneading is done by a piece of equipment and the placement into the oven is done by a piece of equipment? Where can you have intention there? So that's a question that's asked. There are some very, very good answers, which I'm not going to go through now. The basic idea is that guarding something lishma means that you be sure that everything operates correctly. If you have a mashgiach pushing the button and being sure that the equipment doesn't overheat or doesn't damage the product in a way that it affects its kashrut standards, that job of the mashgiach doing it for the sake of a mitzvah is good enough. So therefore, we have no question now. Why, if you ask why I personally have a tradition of eating matzah shmura for the Seder night that is machine. So in the past, I've shared a little bit of a history that in Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, the year was 1908, and there was a person who started a matzah production, machine matzah production, shmura, and some of the Hasidim were unhappy with it because it changes tradition, and they are very traditional. So there was a great rabbi in Yerushalayim, a disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam. And Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam, although he was extremely humble and did not like publicizing the fact that he's a great scholar and publicizing the fact that he's a disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant, he put up posters throughout the city noting that you should know, I, for the Seder night, will only use those matzahs. I think it was the Minsker Bakery. I will only use the Minsker Bakery because they have the highest standard. And he gave his stamp of approval for the Lithuanian community, the non-Hasidic community in Yerushalayim in 1908. And I believe it became the norm by the old-time Eretz Yisrael non-Hasidic community to turn, even for the Seder night, for matzah shmura made by a machine. My grandfather of Aram Malevsky spent 5.5 years in Israel, in Hebron, from 1924 to 1929. He left a few months before the massacre there. And he absorbed, I have no doubt, many of the customs that originated from that community. So my grandfather used always machine shmura. My father did. And for me on the Seder night, as I look at that machine shmura, the square matzah, some years it's better than others when it comes to taste, but that's a different discussion. And by the way, it's important as well. Your matzahs should be kosher, but they should always also be tasty. Because when you want to perform a mitzvah, and as you chew it, you say to yourself, Rabbeinu Shalom, this is shreklach. That's not exactly a way of performing a mitzvah. It should be tasty. And therefore, the quality of your matzah should not just be on kashrut, but should be quality, how it tastes. So some years, what I get is good. Last year was a little bit disappointing, a different discussion. When I eat that matzah and I see its shape, I relate to tradition, my father, my grandfather. And what is the Seder night if not tradition, where I do something that I saw, and God willing, you hope that there's continuity with that practice. It's all about the past and the future. So that's one halachic annual defense that I do. One more thing that is important this year is the following. There's a Mishnah in Tractate Pesachim that talks about the fact that you have to get rid of your chametz before Pesach. And in the days of the Talmud, they did not have the sale of chametz that we are familiar with. It did not exist. But people would actually get rid of their chametz. And the Mishnah deals with the question, is there a requirement of getting rid of it in a very specific way? And the rabbis say, nope. If you want, you could take your chametz, pulverize it, throw it into the wind. If you want, say the chachamim, you could pulverize it if it's hard and throw it into the ocean. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says no. En biur chametz el asrefa. The proper way to get rid of your last bit of chametz in a regular year is by burning it. Now, there are indications that we're supposed to take the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda into consideration. However, the Talmud notes, you know where Rabbi Yehuda got this idea to burn it? Like, where in the Torah are we told to burn our chametz? We're told you shouldn't eat it, you shouldn't derive benefit, you shouldn't have it in your domain. Where do we find this idea of getting rid of it by burning? So the Talmud notes that when you have a korban and you eat the meat, great mitzvah, it reaches a point where the Torah tells us you are no longer allowed to eat it. When it reaches the second morning or the first morning in some cases, the Torah tells us don't eat it. It's called notar. And the Torah tells us that leftover meat after its time of consumption must be burnt. Rabbi Yehuda said, wait a second. If notar, which is not as strict as chametz, must be burnt, how much more so chametz? And that's where Rabbi Yehuda derives his halacha. Chametz is to be burnt, that there's a mitzvah of burning it, because he compares it to notar, leftover meat. But comes Rabbeinu Tam, the great Rabbeinu Tam, and says, you know what? Notar is only burnt after it becomes prohibited. So therefore, the only time you would theoretically have to burn chametz is if you find it after midday Erev Pesach. Since nowadays we get rid of our chametz before midday, and especially this year that we are doing it Erev Shabbat, there is no requirement at all to burn it. Now, Rashi disagrees with him. Rashi disagrees with his grandson. Rashi believed that there's still it's a proper practice, but what is relevant for us is the fact that burning the chametz is a minhag, not a halacha. So therefore, some people have a concern this year, while other years you go out, you go to a chametz burning. We have one here in shul. There are other shuls that have it. This year, right? The fact is that we're not yet where we're still concerned with the pandemic. There are many people that don't have an interest in going out to a burning. What I'm telling you is there's no requirement. If you want to do a good getting rid of chametz, you could flush it down the toilet, not too much at the same time, unless you want to give some parnasa to a plumber, but you don't have to burn it. Burning is not a requirement. So therefore, whatever we're going to work out here in shul, yes, a burning, not a burning, remember, it's not a halacha, it's a minhag. And minhagim have to be placed in proportion, especially in a year like this year. That's another piece of practical information. Another piece of information, and again, as we are preparing, the Talmud tells us that it is important to enter into the Seder night with an appetite. We are supposed to make mitzvot chavivot. It's supposed to be something we're excited about. Another good reason to be sure that your matzah is edible. Now, the Talmud tells us if we're going to sit down for a nice meal an hour before the Seder, it's going to affect our appetite. So therefore, we're given a cutoff time. And I would like to share with you the cutoff time. The cutoff time is 3 hours before the end of the day, Erev Pesach Shabbat. So by 4:30, you should complete your meal. In other words, you can have a morning meal. You can have an afternoon meal, which is appropriate to have a Sudah Shlishit. Okay, we can't have bread and we can't have matzah, but you could sit down for some fruit, fish, herring, whatever you do enjoy. But if it is actually sitting down for a meal, it should be done by 4:30 p.m. Finish by then. After 4:30, if you need, you could snack on something small. You could obviously have a good drink, but a meal not. Why? The Talmud tells us the appetite for the Seder night is extremely important. So that's another piece of information that I think is relevant for our discussion. I'll look briefly at a few of the questions here. So when it comes to the 10 pieces, as I mentioned, you don't have, and you don't need anyone else to put it out. You can put it out yourself, and it's a minhag. If when you're finished with it, you want to just flush it down the toilet, fine. Remember to nullify. It's a very important statement that we make when it comes to chametz, that we declare that all chametz is considered like dust of the earth. It is said twice, once after checking and once on Shabbat by 12:20 p.m., the nullification. Just remember that as well. Okay, so those are a few of the questions that were mentioned. It's, when it comes to a chag like Pesach, I have memories, a lot of memories, and I remember them from my childhood, and many of them relate to my grandparents, my father's parents, my Saba and my Safta. So my Saba, I remember from the Seder. I think I've shared in the past the story how the last year of his life was in 1986. It was a few months before his passing, and unfortunately, he was no longer speaking. I don't know what the medical condition was, but he would just sit there. He just sat there. And we rolled him over to the Seder. And my father calls my brothers and I together, and he says the following: listen, we're sitting here at the Seder. For Savta, for my grandmother, it's very, very hard that Saba is not going to be saying a word. And to distract her, I'm asking all of you to say all of the Haggadah out loud. All of the Haggadah out loud. That's what he turned to my older brother, to me. Okay, became the game of the night, the loud Haggadah. And we all read the Haggadah out loud, and somehow she really got into it, my grandmother, and was distracted from the fact that Saba was just sitting there. We're reading. We reached the point in the Haggadah where Rabban Gamliel says, Kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu lo yatsa yedei chovato. Right? The Haggadah tells us that Rabban Gamliel states, whoever does not say one of these three things for the Seder has not fulfilled his obligation. And at that point, we were silent, and Saba opened his eyes and said, Pesach matzah maror. And he closed his eyes again and went back into his state, whatever state he was. So that's the memories that I have. Now, the memories of Saba might have been those. For Safta, it was that already 8 weeks beforehand, she was kvetching about Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach. And it's important to remember that the bulk of spring cleaning is not really necessary. We've talked about this in the past. You have to make it a positive yontif. Don't make stringencies something that affects the status of your Pesach. Now, a good question was asked here by the Langers. Why is canola oil not kosher for Passover in North America, but good for Israel, but cottonseed is okay here, not in Israel? Wow. So the idea is like this. Technically speaking, it's oils and kitniot are fascinating, and I'll tell you why. If you go back to the 15th, 16th, 17th century, oils from legumes were produced with a process where the bean came in contact with water. And therefore, all rabbinic authorities agreed that if we have a minhag of kitniot, we don't use oils. However, towards the end of the 19th century, there was new heavy equipment that was able to produce oil, what's known as a dry production, where it doesn't come in contact with water. You put the sesames, or you put the canola, or you put the cottonseed, it's pressed down, and you have an oil that seeps out. The great poskim of that era, of the last decades of the 19th century, like Rabbi Shwadron in Galicia, like Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector in Lithuania, gave a green light on such oils. And therefore, really, oils are not really kitniot. Now, you know how it is. It's a minhag. Now, in Israel, especially among the religious Zionists, they follow that school, and they are more lenient with oils. And you could find canola oil with hashgacha for Pesach. And if you are in a community in Israel where that is used, it's a minhag hamakom. Here in North America, we use cottonseed. Cottonseed, the psak was that the cottonseed itself was not a seed that's consumed, so therefore the oil is fine, extremely unhealthy. So therefore cottonseed is fine. What I didn't know is that in Israel they don't use cottonseed. That I don't know. I don't know about what they don't use. I do know that in like Israel is, in some schools they're extremely strict, and my aunt once told me we only use olive oil. And then there are those who say, listen here, we don't have to go ahead and take all the stringencies of the past. And there are Torah observant, very great Torah scholars in Israel that are more lenient, especially with the oils. It's as mentioned, it's confusing. I think my caraway seed is proof that this is an area that you have to follow the minhag, accept it. Obviously, when you're in a community, this is a core issue in Judaism. You live in a community, you follow the community. If they're lenient, you're lenient, right? If I ever decide to land up living in Israel and I'm in a complete Sephardi community, right? I have a very good reason to be lenient. I probably won't, it would be difficult for me, to walk away from a custom, but halachically speaking, minhag is a makom. And that's how we could address that question of Israel. Thank you again to our sponsors. Happy birthday to Matan. Thank you everyone for participating in our discussion. I'll be more than happy to take any questions and emails. Hopefully next week we can talk a little bit more of ideas and less of the halachic discussions. But for now, I wish you everyone a Erev Tov, and may our preparations for this wonderful Chag go well. It's a time to be upbeat. Better days are ahead, even in Canada. It may take longer than Somalia and Congo, but we're going to also get one day to where we should get, and Bezrat Hashem look back and be very appreciative for what we have. So thank you again.